So it's interesting to know who's participating. I think that I'm going to say some things that a few of you know very well, and I hope you just join me with what they call the beginner's mind, that even if you've heard it before, you can listen as if you are not sure or don't know something. And that way, well, I certainly am always learning things. I'm still learning things about systems approach and plant health. Thank you very much to our sponsors. Um, so I'm going to be talking about the International Standard for Phytosanitary Measures, number 14. Again, I'll just mention I work with an Imperial College. I'm showing you slides with logos of FAO and IPPC because we've only just recently completed this project that was funded by the Standards and Trade Development Facility to create tools to support the use of systems approach. So I'll be talking about that more in the course of my presentation. But first, as I say, I'm sure many of you know this, but the framework that we're talking about is for international trade, international movement. It's specifically the International Plant Protection Convention. So this convention is has more than 180 contracting parties. So it's very much a global convention. It actually came into force in 1952. So it's an old convention, but it has come to the forefront more in the 90s when the World Trade Organization recognized it as the standard setting group for plant health in terms of the sanitary and phytosanitary issues. And I'm showing you this slide because if you're not familiar with the Plant Protection Convention, this is where the standard, you would find the standard. This is the homepage a couple of days ago for the convention. And along the top, you can find resources to the far right that I'll mention later, the standards and other materials. So if you do not know about this, I suggest that you go and look under resources under brochures because there's quick summaries of many different aspects of the convention. So as we know, we're talking about this specific ISPM 14. So ISPM 14 is available in the FAO languages, English, French, Spanish, Arabic, Chinese, and Russian. And there's also a translation that's not official, but it was put up by Brazil. So you've covered all of the languages for today. If you have not seen it in your own language, I recommend downloading that. Now, this standard was, if you go to the website, it will say 2019, I believe, because whenever they do style changes or minor edits, it shows the new date. But this standard was actually endorsed by the working body of the convention, which is all of representatives of all of those countries, in 2002. And it has not been substantially revised since that time. And so you can go through the standard, but I'm going to be talking about things that maybe you would have to read between the lines and just reminding you of the concepts and the basis of the standard. So first off, there's an official definition, systems approach. And we're going to come back to this, but systems approach, it's a pest risk management option that integrates different measures, at least two of which act independently with cumulative effect. And as you can see, that was the definition. It was prepared in 2002. It was slightly revised by the Interim Commission of Phytosanitary Measures 2005 and just recently updated. But fundamentally, this has been the concept from 2002. And I began my career in plant health in the 1980s, and it was definitely being used considerably by some regions, especially I would say in trade with the United States. All of Latin America was using systems approach fairly early, but there was a need to make it a harmonized, agreed definition and guidance. So today, what I want to do is just perhaps approach it from the from the end and go back again to the definition. Why would you use systems approach? Excuse me. I may have to stop for a second. So why would, let me just pause for a second. I promise you it's not COVID. So why would you use systems approach? And then also, just to give you a better understanding of systems approach, I'm going to review the basic concepts and help you with to find out what some of the available resources are. And then I also want to talk about the role of the National Plant Protection Organization, because it's very important to understand that the NPPO is in fact the final arbitrator on this. And then Theo is going to talk about specific examples. Sorry for this. Okay, I'm just going to turn off my fan so it's not so bad. So why would you use systems approach? You would use it if there's no other option. So there are situations that have come up over the last 20 years or longer, really, where a pesticide or fumigant has been banned. So what you've normally been using isn't there anymore, and you have to come up with an alternative. And usually it is more effective and faster to come up with a systems approach than to try to create a new treatment like a new pesticide or to change fumigations. The other thing is if there's a single measure that's not working. And I really want to make this clear that if a country is not applying a measure properly and it's not working, that's not the same thing. So systems approach is not a mop-up way to take care of bad application of measures. And that's a different problem. So if your measures are not working because they're not done properly, that's not what I'm talking about. So what I'm talking about is, what if you had a trade agreement and things were agreed, but you're finding more and more that there are problems, that there are interceptions. There was an example like in the 1990s, I think, where there was citrus coming from Europe to the United States, and they had been shipping for years with cold treatment, and all of a sudden it didn't work. And what they found was that the pest population in the orchards had gotten so high that the treatment didn't work any longer. And so that's when it became a systems approach of having more than one measure. The other reason you might use systems approach is to avoid an outright ban or prohibition. So if you have a pest or pathway that is very difficult, maybe it's hard to control, or you don't know all of the host range, or it's something that once it enters, there's no way to stop it. Countries would be tempted to use a ban, but you could try to create a systems approach. You could also use systems approach if it's a better option. So let's say that your country wants to do something, but you don't have the infrastructure. Maybe irradiation is an option, but you don't have it. Maybe you are using a treatment, but it's causing a quality problem. Or if you simply want to get on with trade, and I've seen this over and over, it's not quite in the spirit of the WTO, but if you just want to get on with trade, you can build a systems approach by adding things that your importing partner wants to see. But during the negotiation, you can ask, is this something that we could review in 2 or 3 years, because we don't really think it's necessary. And the other thing is, that's very common, maybe you have large international companies in your countries that are ready to export. And you have a lot of small growers who are not quite up to that standard yet. I've also seen where systems approach can be negotiated and used as a pathway. So those who are not ready to export to the most demanding countries can learn all of the skills, can increase the capacity by working slowly through the components of the systems approach. For example, possibly by starting with traceability, working with monitoring and other things that they might not currently be doing. So this is all my opinion. It's not something that appears in the standard. But I also want to say, why wouldn't you? So while systems approach is a really good option, it does require shared responsibility, and it could require more management because of the various things that are added together to make the system. You would have to engage with stakeholders. So if you have a sector that's not at all organized, as an MPPO, it would be difficult to carry out a systems approach. I know there are countries where traceability has not reached the small farmer. And in fact, I've even been speaking to traceability companies recently and talking about this issue, that if you're trying to use a systems approach where you need to be able to trace back, um, you need to have traceability. And so that is something that might not be ready. But the other thing is, if you're already having trade and it's going fine and there's no problems, then there's no particular reason to change. So that's, again, these are my opinions, but like anything, systems approach is an option. It's not the only way to trade. Okay, so this is a graphic from an article that we wrote for the International Year of Plant Health. It's just to give you an idea. Systems approach. You can do things pre-season, during planting, during the growing phase. You could make choices about bagging or covering your fruit that's ripening. You can harvest immature before it's ripe. There's things that you can do at each point along a pathway that would reduce or practically eliminate the possibility of the pest of concern being present in your shipment. So other concepts. Okay, I know that you all are aware of risk, but a surprising number of people who work in many different fields forget that risk is a probability concept. So what that means is there's a chance that something's going to happen. But if it doesn't happen, that doesn't mean that the risk has gone away. If it does happen, it doesn't mean that all your plans were pointless. It's a probability of the bad thing happening. And so the definition of pest risk for quarantine pest, that is the official definition of the IPPC, is the probability of an introduction. An introduction is when a pest enters and results in establishment. So it gets into your territory and stays there. So it's that, the probability of introduction and spread of a pest and the magnitude of the associated potential economic consequences. And pest risk analysis, as you are aware, is the process of evaluating biological or other scientific and economic evidence to determine whether an organism is a pest. That's the first step. Whether it should be regulated. And then the part that I've highlighted is the strength of any phytosanitary measures to be taken. So I know you've heard these concepts before, but they're extremely important to understand systems approach. The definition of pest risk management is the evaluation and selection of options to reduce the risk of introduction and spread of a pest. And so you estimate how much risk there is, and you have possibly put together some sort of management plan, but maybe you have to add additional things in order to reach the appropriate level of protection of the importing country. But any of you who are actually working in this field know that these words they have definitions, but in the real world, It's very hard to say exactly what is the appropriate level of protection, exactly what is the estimated risk. And so we're dealing with concepts that um, are are im- are very clear in writing, but are a bit fluid in practice. And that's really where systems approach is helpful, is that you can be adding or changing things in a responsive way. So I think anyone who's experienced would agree with my opinion, which is not written in any official text, is that really what countries are doing is focusing on reducing the risk of entry. You rarely are going to have a trade agreement that focuses on reducing the risk of spread or the consequences of spread. That's very much a domestic matter. It's not about international trade. And this convention is very much based on international trade. It's not about domestic pest issues. It's about preventing the spread to new territories of regulated pest. So another thing I want to mention is something that is not defined by the IPPC, but I think we've tried to call it realized efficacy or performance, perhaps. I just took this little picture from Bayesian network. If you have designed a measure and you've tested it, then you know how much efficacy it might have. And so there's a possible maximum amount of efficacy, like in the lab or on the experimental farm. But in the real world, when you implement it, it may not come up to that level. There could be things that happen. Um, you could be spraying a pesticide and it rains immediately afterwards, and it's simply not as efficacious. Um, and the other thing that affects how well things go in phytosanitary measures is how much pest infestation or how much pest population, or what we've started calling the pest challenge, is present. So again, it's not really a defined concept under the glossary of the IPPC, but it's very important in terms of designing your systems approach. And then the last thing I want to mention, just as a general concept, is about uncertainty. So there's natural variation when you're working with, it's biology. There's variation within a population of the same species of pest. There's also sometimes limited or outdated information. Your observations may be different places, different times. There's uncertainty in methodology, for example, with sampling or inspection. There's uncertainty because you may be using information that's from a different place. You want to do some trade and someone else has done it, but you have to write up your own conditions and situation of your own country. But there's also uncertainty if you ask experts' opinion. And so in some of the things I'll show you, we've tried to address that. We've talked about uncertainty and elicitation. If you are going to ask a group of people their opinion on something, some people are more cautious than other people. Even when we ask this question, if you're comfortable using systems approach, I found over the years that if you ask a group of people that, and people might actually say that they're more comfortable than after they've learned a lot. The more they learn, the less they realize they're comfortable. So they may have more expertise, but actually rate themselves lower. And so this aspect of self-correction in elicitation is something that we've had to take into account when creating tools. So just to wrap up about concepts, as you all know, pest risk management is designed to be in relation to the estimated risk, which is a probability concept. So the outcome is what matters. The outcome is to meet the appropriate level of protection for the importing country. You may get there through different ways. Oftentimes, equivalence agreements are based on systems approach. So if you don't like what's being offered to you, then you can try to negotiate something else. You can, in fact, I'll just pause to say the project that paid for these tools was called Beyond Compliance. And I want to say it's very hard to comply. And so the reason we called it beyond compliance is that very aspect of gaining confidence in order to go back and say to the importing country, I have a different idea. You've given me a set of management measures. I want to propose something different. So we're trying to build up that confidence to be able to really negotiate with force. So then the other concepts I wanted to summarize: pest risk, it can be managed with a combination of measures. And we'll talk about what does independent measures mean. So you may have to have some other measures to implement a system that hasn't been required. So if you are relying on fumigation at the end, after consolidation in the packing house, then you would be thinking about what's happening in the packing house to the shipment, to the export site where the fumigation chamber might be. But if you're relying on something like field sanitation, trapping and monitoring, measures that are taking place during production, you actually need to go all the way back to where did this product come from? Which farm did it come from? And so there might be additional measures required that do not reduce the risk, but help you implement the system. So there are definitions about treatment efficacy. There's no definition about a system efficacy. For treatments, they ask for a defined, measurable, and reproducible effect. I'm just applying that to the system in this, saying it is possible to design, test, and continually perfect over time a system so that it is measurable and reproducible. And a control point is not required by ISPM 14, but all of my colleagues feel that it's an extremely important advantage of working with systems approach. That is where you would stop during the system. You would monitor, you would measure, you would do something at some point in the system where you can verify, is it working? So instead of waiting until your shipment has gone all the way to the importing country and they find a problem, you would be able to stop, divert that lot or that farm's produce if there's a problem, or possibly correct it depending on where you are in the system. So that's something that we emphasize, is that control point or that verification, real-time verification, I should say. And the final thing on that is just to say it's biology. So no matter what, something can still go wrong. And that's true. I mean, there's always risk. There's always risk when there's a pest associated with what you're trading in. So the goal, of course, is to reduce the risk, but also not to overwhelm it, because there's always going to be some residual risk, and it's more realistic to manage it as close as possible to the point of acceptable risk. So I wanted to just mention a few resources. If you face this question of, well, okay, maybe I want to use a systems approach, what am I supposed to do? You come to this question when you're working on the pest risk analysis. And data on biology, distribution, and so forth is really critical. And this is where CABI comes to the forefront globally in terms of quality, accessibility, and usability of the information. I think some of you have been trained in the PRA tool recently, and you know that being able to just reach into the compendium or the PRA tool and get that information is so time saving time. It's such a easier way to work than to have to go doing literature reviews and finding it all yourself. Pest status for the country. You're supposed to have that up to date with the IPPC should have that information. And so if there's a regulated pest, there should be surveys, it should be reported to the IPPC, and that's published So it's a source, but it's only as good as everyone contributing and putting things into the system. Things like host status, association of pest with crops. There's a lot of research around this. There's varieties that are resistant. That information is out there, but there's also a standard relating to this now. And efficacy of treatments is in the treatment database of the IPPC. It's on the website. So the next resource I want to mention is we all rely on expert knowledge. So for the kind of things that you do in plant health, you're using information from many different sources. Even when you get to the management phase, you're not thinking only of scientific biology. You're thinking of economic impact, environmental impact, whether people can carry something out or not. There's many different factors in that decision. So expert knowledge is very important, and it complements hard data from experiments and literature. But I believe that it's always involved in any of these decisions. So next, I want to just mention some tools that we have created through the Beyond Compliance Project, which actually initially, some years ago, we were working in Southeast Asia with CABI and the University of Queensland, University of Technology. So these things have evolved over a long time. And we've got it down to two things that we think are user-friendly and effective. So these are tools that are going to be available on the IPPC website within a couple of months. So one is a graphic representation of what you're doing. It's just slightly more detailed of idea of steps along a production chain. And the other is an Excel-based tool for organizing your discussion with experts about what is the efficacy and what would be the best combination of measures. Now, these tools do not answer your questions. You have to put good information in to get a good information out, but also what they're doing is organizing and showing it so that it's easier to discuss, to work with different stakeholders and to draw conclusions. But it's not like a machine where you put something in and the answer pops out at the end. It requires people who actually know about the pest, about the production, that understand the country's conditions and what's likely to work or not work. And so I know you can't see the whole thing here, but just to quickly say what we did is it's since the 1980s, you'll find publications talking about the stages. And even in the standard, it talks about you can do things pre-planting, during planting, during production, at harvest, and so forth. And so what we did was we created a separate column where we said, well, why are you doing it? So what's the objective of the measure? And we did that to help MPPOs and those trading to really think for several things. One is to look at it and say, is this necessary? Is this the best choice? If you have 5 measures to reduce the pest challenge or the pest population, do you need a measure that's has a different objective? Almost all systems approach, for example, have something that's safeguarding at the end. So after harvest, they say in the standard it's to prevent reinfestation, but whether it's reinfested or simply post-harvest infestation, it could even be a different pest. So that's an additional objective. That's a different thing. So you could have completely clean products and you get to the packing house and on the way to the port, something gets into your shipment. So that's a different objective to protect that. We also started using color coding just to think about, are there things that are maybe commercial but not official? Are there things that are actually verifying the whole system and so forth? And Thea is going to share a real example of this. And then the other tool is one where we put in the information from the PRA or dossier that we thought was most relevant. And we, so those are things that would affect your choice. So you could do a PRA and then say, I'm ready to apply measures. But for example, if you don't have a very good diagnostic technique, or if there's other sources of this pest in trade or something, it might affect what you choose. And that leads through to listing the measures you're thinking about and rating them. This should rely on scientific information, literature, and so forth, but it also relies on expert opinion. And this is a way that you can combine them in one place. And these tools have been used by stakeholders in Southeast Asia. And then we have a group of people from 12, well, not 12 different, we have 12 people from 10 countries that have been using this and being trained. And they're now validated as facilitators, which Theo's one of them. And those are people for different regions who can give some advice. So the final thing I want to mention on resources is that, again, on the IPPC website, under the implementation and capacity development is a page called phytosanitary system. And there is a place that says systems approach. I never had noticed this before over the years, but they're just starting to fill in these. So there's not a lot there yet, but in the next 2 months, we're slowly adding things. We're adding an infographic video that we've commissioned just to explain basically systems approach. There are different ISPMs and manuals and things that might be relevant that are brought together under a systems approach. And then there's going to be a place where you can download the tools that I've just mentioned, along with user manuals and anything you need in all the 6 languages. So my last point is just to say that the MPPO is critical for working with systems approach. Some countries have governments that do not fund the MPPO sufficiently, or there's not enough resources available, or there aren't enough people, or there's turnover in staff. All of this is a challenge, but the MPPO is in charge. So please do not be intimidated if you have a private sector that appears to have much more than you have, or is way ahead of you. This is not like global GAP, fair trade, or any of those things. This is a formal bilateral agreement. And you're either working with a bilateral agreement or you're using ISPMs. Either way, the MPPO is in charge. And so I'm just wanting to say, like, you know, this is an official agreement. So I haven't been able to read the chat. I see things are coming up. I'll just quickly end by saying that the other thing that you shouldn't forget is that you have to take care of your country with your import perspective. So the overall risk to anybody's country is from many, many different sources. You may have a bilateral agreement for export or for import as well, but that doesn't cover everything related to that pest, most likely. And so your export opportunities are only as good as your national pest status for regulated pest. And your national pest status is only as good as the strategy you have for protecting your country with appropriate import requirements, contingency planning, and so forth. So export, trade, and our pest risk management of systems approach is just one part of the bigger picture. So I've tried to explain system approach concepts, and I know I've run over a little, so I will just leave you with the contact for the Beyond Compliance project, but it will be on the IPPC website.
From my side, the task that I'm given is to give experience and the background of how in South Africa we implemented ISPN 14 to enhance our compliance to the export requirements especially for EU. And this has been a project that we work on for a couple of years. When we started, then we had to look at different methods of meeting the export requirements. Next slide, please. My presentation is outline will be about, I'm just going to go on how is our NPO in South Africa is made of and our mandate. Then I'll go also on our previous regime and measures that we used and the challenges that we faced, then that forced us to move to systems approach. And then why did we use systems approach? And then what are the benefits and what traits did we get out of using systems approach? And from our analysis from South Africa, what did we see is the areas on systems approach to use to make sure that we comply? And also, study that I'm going to use is the citrus that we export from South Africa to the EU. And I'm hoping that the lessons that we learn in South Africa is a lesson that I might pose to the rest of the attendees of the webinar to say what we can learn from this or from our experience and then take it forward to our own countries or take forward to try and implement the same if possible. And then the last one will be conclusion. And South Africa is, we've got an NPO called NPO ZA. Megan has mentioned in the previous talk that NPPO is a key in terms of systems approach. So in South Africa, our NPPO is made up of plant health, which is a directorate that is developing the policies, and also it's housing the PRA division. That's where the PRA is coming from for us to work on any import conditions for our own country. Then we also have a food import export standard directorate. This directorate is responsible for issuing of import permits if there is a requirement or there is a need for any country to import into our country. Then we got the inspection services. This directorate is the implementation directorate that carries out all the imports inspection and export inspection. This is also the directorate that is monitoring all the steps and options that are available in the systems approach to make sure that we are compliant in terms of our export markets. Next slide, please. The basic agricultural mandate for our country is derived from the WTO SPS agreement, and especially in this talk, it's relevant to our Annex C, which is about inspection and conformity to requirements. Then the next one will be that what is the core, the IPPC, and using the guidelines of ISPM to develop the systems approach and also to develop any critical options and inspection points to meet the export requirement. And also what is important is our standard, the constitution of the country that allows us then to make sure that we've got sufficient food in terms of agriculture, and then that is entrenched in the Bill of Rights of our country. Then the last one will be the Agricultural Pest Act that allows then the domestic regulation, national controls, and export and import. Then what we have before, we were very much dependent on the good agricultural practices, depending on the producers and the farmers. And then we also very much relied on chemical applications and also our own last option was just the final inspection whenever we want to export. But these three, as much as we're working previously, but we face the challenge of changes in export requirements of different trading partners. And then we also had more interceptions on certain markets. And then some of the pests becoming quarantine pests in these importing countries. So we had to adjust to improve our compliance. But unfortunately, in most cases, then we were challenged with infrastructure that we could not meet. And then sometimes it was not feasible for us or as a country to put all these measures in place. And sometimes it was costly. So your small producers could not afford to have all these measures in place for them to export. The other biggest challenges were also at one stage we were using what we call a standalone cold treatment for citrus to the EU, but it came with also challenges of it was detrimental to the fruit or to the commodity. You find it affecting the quality of the fruit, shelf life, and so on. It is damaged when it gets to the importing country. So then we all use mostly the fumigation, the metal bromide. We know metal bromide is not good for the ozone, and also the Montreal protocol is also discouraging country to use the fumigant. So the agrochemicals that we're relying on as well, we've got lots of challenges as well. I think everyone knows about the glyphosate that is in the news, and is also about litigations about the claims of what it does to human health. And then the last one, then what we had was using these chemicals, then we face the issue of maximum residue levels on food, even though this is not a plant health issue, but it's a food safety issue, but it was causing non-compliance in the exporting countries. So why did we choose systems approach? We realized that we needed a friendlier measures that will meet the appropriate level of phytosanitary protection of the importing countries. So for us to do that, we needed to have not only one measure that can meet that, but then maybe more independent measures that can also meet the import requirements of that country, but that are not detrimental to our environment, are also not challenged by the environmental organization. But the systems approach also, it's measurable. And when you see, like Megan mentioned, that each critical point or control point, when you realize that you haven't met your threshold or your outcome that you expected, you can always adjust and then adopt a new or add or correct. So for us, we looked at also it's a sustainable measure to use systems approach because we use less chemicals in terms of our compliance. Then also systems approach is it's less trade restrictive, because others you find that they are restrictive in terms of to get your small producers, exporters to get the market. And the last one then is less detrimental to your commodity, to your fruit, because as you on the next slide, I'll show you that we use more biological control, so we use less chemicals. So in South Africa, we looked at control points or the areas that we needed to implement a systems approach that will make sure that we are compliant when we have to export. So number one being the orchard, then number two being the packing house, and then looking at the shipping regime at the end of the three approaches. Then we delve down into each, starting with the orchard. Basically, the study that I'm presenting is the citrus that is going to the EU. So what we do is we start by registering every producer that is interested to export to the markets that we presenting. The reason for registration, we want to have a traceability. At this point, we give the farmer or the grower what we call a production unit code. That becomes the ID that whenever in the value chain we pick up a non-compliance, that ID will take us back to the orchard there where the fruit was produced. And by also doing that, we want a commitment and the undertaking from the grower that they will comply to all the conditions that as an NPPO will put forward to them, and in terms of monitoring and do all the requirements at the orchard level for them to access the market that we are getting from the EU. So then the next step will be then we do a trap monitoring. Trap monitoring, then what we do is we train officials within the space to be able to be competent and be able to monitor the population on the traps and how to set up the traps and how to service the traps on weekly intervals. And then what we also do, and at this point in the registration and this monitoring, in South Africa, we got a system that is called Fight Clean. The Fight Clean is an online database that is used to register for certain markets, and then it's fed information from the farm. Before we used to do it, then the farmers or the growers will send us the paperwork couriered to our Pretoria office. Then we take the whole box and put it up on our system. But now what we did, this system that we have, the farmer, when he's registered, is given credentials to log into the system and to report all the activities that are being followed on the farm, on the orchard, on a weekly basis. And then the next one, we do orchard sanitation. We believe, not written anywhere, but on our observation, that the orchard sanitation, if everything is carried correctly on the orchard sanitation, we say 75% of non-compliance has already been eliminated at that stage. Because what happens on the orchard sanitation, when they look at the fruit that is dropped from the trees, it must be inspected if it's damaged, and then also it must be then buried or be destroyed to avoid attraction of pests in the region or in the area. So we also do fruit infestation monitoring. That is also done on a weekly basis. Then the person that is doing that, it must be a trained person that is competent, and we also audit those people, their skills and everything they do. And then we move them to packing house. Then we're in the packing house. What we look at is there is a critical control point there, which is the delivery inspection. So when the fruit comes from the orchard, and then when it comes to the pack house, it must be inspected. There at that spot, that's where we check if there's any infestation. But this spot also assists the grower. If then there's an infestation or there's a rejection, then the grower has got an option to look for a different market that is less sensitive to, let's say, to false cod moth infestation, maybe in terms of the threshold. But if on this point the grower has surpassed the threshold, therefore their fruit will be rejected, then they're an option of taking a different market. Then we do a fruit grading. Then that we do online, also that we check one more that there's nothing that is missed, like this is a system, everything can be checked, but maybe we can miss something out. The packaging is we're looking at how is it packaged, and then it must be labeled, it must be clean packaging, and then what is more important packaging, they must put what we call then the PUC, the production unit code, which is very important, as I said, for the traceability purpose, so that we can see everything back to the orchard. Then we come in as a department, and our assignee that is called PPCB. Either one of us will do the phytosanitary inspection. Then that is the last inspection that we do before an export. Then that determines then whether the consignment is compliant or it meets the requirements for export, especially now in this case to the EU. If it meets that, then the consignment it's passed for export. And then on the shipping and certification, then that's where we come in. Then we require, when the pack house is registered, we also register the pack house for the specific market, because they must also comply, and they must also try and do or undertake to do the conditions on our requirements for them to pack for a certain market. So in that case, and when they do that, then we are required them that once the consignment is inspected and complied with, and then it must be isolated, and it must be separated from the rest of the other consignment to safeguard it from reinfestation, because there can be cross-infestation within the pack houses, because they're also packing for different markets at different times. So in this case, they must safeguard the consignment. Then, because of all the measures that we had in place before, our shipping regime then changes drastically, because now we don't use the standalone cold treatment. The cold treatment before, what used to happen is that it used to start from what we called land-based cold sterilization, which means you are supposed to be already under cold treatment even before it goes to a vessel. So it prolonged the shipment and the cold treatment regime to get it to the shipping lines. So then in this case, because of the control measure that we had in place, so the shipping regime and the temperature control is less, and the time is much shorter. And then the NPPO, as we said, is an important part of the systems approach. Then we'll issue then the phytosanitary certificate in compliance with the measures that were taken, and so to indicate that all the measures that were agreed between the two trading partners were followed and we complied with. So what would be then a lesson taken out of this from our country, and I hope from the attendees of the webinar? Systems approach reduces reliance on chemicals, and also is less detrimental to your commodity, to your fruit, so it doesn't really damage it. And then in South Africa, we have implemented systems approach for a very long time, and I must say we believe it's been successful, and because we had less interception when it comes to commodity or to a crop that we use systems approach. For argument's sake, we used to export capsicum. We had a lot of interception, but once we introduced the systems approach, and then we had less interceptions. Even to confirm our last season, we didn't even have a single interception from the EU from the capsicum export, because that we have used the systems approach. In South Africa, we work with Research Institute and University, especially the Citrus Research International, in terms of reviewing our measures continuously. We try to review them every second year, looking at the seasons, previous seasons, and try and improve the measures. An example of what we did is now the latest one is the 2020 protocol. The 2020 protocol has taken a lot of other measures out of the systems approach. Previously, as I said, we were just throwing the chemicals to make sure that we comply. But now, even the traps that we used to use the traps as an interception tool as well. But now traps, we use them as just to monitor the population activity around the orchard, but not as a measure then to reject or not to approve the export. Because of that, then we have opened up the market more to the growers, because now, and our rejection is more on what we call a pellet rejection. Before it used to be an orchard rejection, but now it's a pellet rejection because of all these measures. It's only on the last point that we might find that maybe there's something that went through, but in the beginning, we used just to reject. Once we find something, the orchard then is off for the season, they can only re-register for the following season. But Now it doesn't work like that. We only now reject on the pellets that we find a pest of quarantine that for the exporting country. South Africa has gained more market access and trade agreements because of the systems approach. The systems approach has helped us a lot in terms of increasing our export. Previously, we used to have a lot of interceptions. Now, on top of our biggest market, which is the European Union, we also gained China. And I think lately, all read maybe in the news or heard in the news, also the Philippines is our biggest market as well now in terms of our citrus. At this stage, systems approach, the biggest commodities that we use in the systems approach on is our citrus to the EU, the prunus or the stone fruit also to the EU, and the capsicum. So those three are our biggest at this stage, and we are going strong. So on my conclusion, for systems approach to be acceptable and be successful, we need to cooperate within the space of agriculture. Our stakeholders, especially the government and the private sector, as I said, the CRI in South Africa is working closely with us. We must admit that as a government, we always find ourselves a bit behind, but the private sector is always in advance. So by working together, then we work out all the solutions, then the research institutes help us then to get reliable scientific information and justification for all the measures we want to put in place. And especially our effective communication strategies, because what we do in South Africa, we have forums where we meet up with the stakeholders in the different industries, being the citrus, deciduous fruit. So in those forums, then we communicate the bigger picture as to what is important to all of us, that as a country, the contribution of the export to our income and also to creating jobs for our country, then we need to work together to make sure that we are compliant when it comes to export. And then we need to work together, not against each other. And then we also require a reliable scientific information to justify if there's anyone querying why would you set a measure. And then also a good plant health legislation that we must put based on a PRA that we conduct if it's an import, and based on the analysis of if it's an exporting country or we're exporting to different countries. And also lately, on what Megan says, we very much are happy to have the beyond compliance tools once they are up and running in the IPPC website. We start using them. As we said, this is not a tool to choose which measure to use, but is a tool that will help for the stakeholders and the government and the MPPO to identify control points where they need to concentrate more to make sure that they meet the import requirement of the exporting country and make sure that they sustain and maintain the market moving forward. So this is the tool that we were talking about. Basically, it's the tool that we developed as a team that will help to engage the stakeholders when you then work on your market access of the importing country. So the tool itself, it shows different stages in the production or the production chain of your crops. But what is more important, that it shows at what stage and what measure must you put in place, and then it answers the question, why do then you put that measure? Then the outcome of that measure tells you right on this tool that what are we trying to achieve at this point. So then also what you can do is that if you see the concentration of maybe the non-compliances you see at a certain point of the production, and then you can concentrate on that and try to come up with better measures that will make sure at that stage you eliminate most of your non-compliances there, So what is nice about it, if you can see it there, like in my previous presentation, on the production, especially on the orchard, you can see that's the measures that we looked at, and then on your left-hand side, it show you the objective or the measures that we use in the blue bubbles. Those measures, what are we expecting the outcome of those all measures to be? So it's very helpful as the NPPOs that if we use this, then as to engage our stakeholders and then to come up just to help to assist, to engage, not necessarily to come up with an option, but to engage and then to see more which will work better. In this case, I divided this into three. As you see, this one is for the packing house. Then the packing house, you can see the activity that goes to the packing house and the measures within the packing house that must be adopted and must be implemented, and the objectives. So on the yellow bubbles, it shows then this is where the measures that you can adopt or you can adjust at any given time in the process, then to make sure that you comply fully. You can either then mitigate, or maybe you can either then maybe at that stage then reject the whole process. And based on the information that we have, like Megan says, this tool, it's great to use, but this tool needs to be fed information, scientific information, and whoever is using it must understand maybe the whole risk pathway for either the pest that you are dealing with in this case. This one, the last one, then it will be your shipping regime and the certification. So there as well, you can see the objective and the measures that you put in place. Then on the yellow bubbles, you see that then you can still there do adjustment or mitigations, then or they can reject there, or then either then you can divert to a different market at that stage. So this tool is very helpful in terms of assisting to engage then the stakeholders. Thank you very much.